Hello, and welcome to AmericanNavalHistory.com. My name is John Sorensen, and I'm putting together a series of lessons to teach the history of the United States Navy. AmericanNavalHistory.com is dedicated to teaching the history of the United States Navy and its heritage as a global force for good. Today I will be taking a look at a man whose name is legendary in the history of the United States Navy. Other officers have performed more important roles during the Revolutionary War and in other wars since then, but no name in the history of the United States Navy has equal billing with the name of Captain John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones's original name was simply just John Paul. His father was a gardener in Scotland, and now different books give different ages, but it's pretty much agreed that he left home and went to sea somewhere between 13 and 15 years of age. He was quite young, but the exact age, I wouldn't be the judge of which book was right. But it is agreed that he departed on his first voyage from Whitehaven, England, and he learned how to navigate, and he became the third mate on a slave ship when he was 17 years old. And by the time he was 19 years old, he made first mate on another slave ship. Now, first mate, that's the executive officer. That's the second in command. So by the age of 19, being made the first mate, that's pretty good. And then, by all accounts, all books say this, that he was just totally disgusted with the slave trade, and he just didn't want to do that anymore, and he resigned his position. He just quit his job, walked off, because he just didn't want any part of the slave trade. Now, when John Paul quit the slave trade, and he quit the slave business, his employer owned several ships, and he gave John Paul a free passage as a passenger aboard another ship called the John back to England. So John Paul got onto a ship called the John, and he was a passenger, was not part of the crew, was not an officer, just a passenger on the ship going from the West Indies back to England. And during the voyage back to England, the ship's captain and the ship's first mate, they both died of disease during that transit. John Paul was the only person on board the ship who actually knew how to navigate the ship. So, a passenger steps up and says, I can lead us home in an emergency situation. And he did. Okay, he took command of the ship and returned it safely back to Whitehaven. In Whitehaven, England, that's where the ship's home port was, and it was John Paul's home port. And the ship's owner was so impressed that he gave John Paul command of the John, and at the age of 21, John Paul became a merchant vessel captain. So at a very young age, he became the first mate, and at the age of 21, that was at 17, and at the age of 21, he became captain of his own ship. Okay, and while serving aboard the John, down in the West, took a trip back down to the West Indies. He had to discipline one of the seamen on board. Now, when I say discipline, they had the old whips and the lashes, and they whipped them. They flogged them, is the term they used. And this man's name was Mongo Maxwell. And Maxwell brought charges against John Paul that his lashings were too severe. But the charges were dropped because I guess they were determined to be frivolous, is the word they used. And a couple of weeks later, Maxwell died, and John Paul was arrested and charged with murder. Now, since Maxwell had checked aboard another ship for another job, he had to sign on to the ship, and he signed that he was in good health. So on a couple weeks, so within that time, he had stated that he was in good health, and he had actually signed that. So the murder charges against John Paul were dropped, but John, he went up to Virginia where his brother was, and at that time he started living around his brother, and he started signing his name John Paul Jones instead of just John Paul. He added the alias to it, and that's when he became known as John Paul Jones. When the Revolutionary War broke out, John Paul Jones signed on as the first lieutenant to the very first ship acquired by the Continental Navy. That was the Alfred. Remember, the Alfred was Ezek Hopkins' personal flagship, and it was aboard the Alfred that Jones took part in the raid on New Providence Island down in the Bahamas. And we have a whole separate lesson devoted to the New Haven, to the New Providence Island raid down the Bahamas on AmericanNavalHistory.com. It was on June 14, 1777, that the Continental Congress promoted John Paul Jones to the rank of captain. And that was the same day that Congress adopted the Stars and Stripes as our national flag. And it was also exactly 2 years after that they had adopted the Continental Army. So today we celebrate June 14th as the birthday of the United States Army, and it was also Flag Day. But if you really want to be a history buff, you would know that it was also the day that John Paul Jones became a captain in the United States Navy. And on that day, Jones was also given command of the Ranger, and he was sent to France. And it was in France that he became real good friends with Benjamin Franklin, who was the American ambassador over there. After arriving in France aboard the Ranger in December 1777, Jones began politicking because he wanted command of a much bigger ship that was being built in a Dutch shipyard for the Continental Congress. The L'Ondiant was a 40-gun frigate being built for the Continental Navy. However, the British did find out about the L'Ondiant, and they put a lot of pressure on the Dutch government not to deliver that ship to the Americans. Benjamin Franklin was in Paris working the L'Ondiant issue with Jones, and was also working to gain France's support for their war effort against Great Britain. And Franklin tutored Jones on the art of political persuasion. While Jones was politicking for his ship, the Ranger was being serviced. So the ship was in port, and Jones was in Paris, hanging out with all the politicians, trying to maneuver himself to a bigger and better command. Okay, its bottom, his ship, the Ranger, its bottom was being scraped, the mast was being trimmed. A lot of work was being done on the Ranger while he was politicking for the L'Ondiant. Its crew the crew of the Ranger was not anxious to go back to sea, though, because they were expecting to receive some prize money from a prize that they had captured, but the money wasn't forthcoming. The crew of the Ranger was far more interested in capturing ships at sea and receiving prize money than they were about conducting raids or winning a war. Jones wanted glory, and his crew was only interested in winning prize money. Since the Ranger was such a small ship, Jones wanted to use it to launch shore raids in the British homeland instead of capturing prizes. He figured he'd do better for the war effort doing that, but that's not what his crew was interested in. And it would be safe to say that the crew of the Ranger and the captain of the Ranger had a very strained relationship, and they had different goals in what they wanted out of the voyage. So Captain Jones, John Paul Jones, he chose Whitehaven to be the target of the very first shore raids. Remember, Whitehaven was where he shipped out of when he was a young man, and he chose Whitehaven because he had sailed in and out of that port many times when he was a young seaman learning how to navigate. But on their way to Whitehaven, the crew came very close to mutiny. Jones had to actually put a pistol to the head of one of the ringleaders and dare the rest of the crew to move on him. But once he got back in control of the ship and the crew, Jones made their approach to the Ranger made its approach to Whitehaven, and the winds died down long before they got close in. So they had to launch their assault boats from the ship at a much further distance than they wanted to, because there was just no wind to take them any closer. and the tide was coming out, and so it was a long and hard, or very arduous row, and the oarsmen got very tired, by the time they got there. It took them 3 hours to row from the ship to the shore, and by the time they arrived at the wharf, the sun was beginning to rise. It was almost morning, and Jones and a midshipman. They went up to take control of a gun battery that overlooked the harbor, and the rest of the crew was assigned to burn about 250 boats and ships that were in the harbor. And while Jones and the midshipmen went up to capture the gun battery that was overlooking the harbor. Well, one of the crew members was actually a British seaman that had signed on to the crew in order to get a ride back home. And once he got ashore in Whitehaven, he decided, well, that's about the time he was going to desert the crew and stay out of the fight. But not only did he desert, but he proceeded to knock on all the doors of all the people that were asleep, and all the residents that lived in Whitehaven, and he warned them all that the town was being raided. Okay, and meanwhile, the rest of the crew that was out to the 250 boats in the harbor, the rest of the crew that was out to burn all those ships, they decided to stop off at a local pub to have a few drinks instead of setting fire to the ships in the port. So, this is Jones's situation. He's up there in the gun battery with the midshipmen, and they're taking over the guns, the cannons that are overlooking the port, and the crew that was supposed to go and burn the ships in the port, they decided to stop off, and they were having beer in the port, in the local bar, and there's one guy knocking on everybody's door saying, wake up, you're being raided by the Americans. Oh, and on the morning of April 23rd, this is on the morning of April 23rd, 1778, Jones was totally upset about the whole misadventure, and he blamed everything that didn't work right on the crew, and he said if he had the crew of the Providence, that was his former ship, then all the vessels in port there, they would have been laid to ashes. But that's not the crew he had, so that's not what happened. And well, when Jones did get his crew rounded up and back into the boats, they rowed themselves back out to the Ranger, and they crossed the bay to St. Mary's Isle. And Jones had a plan there to kidnap a British aristocrat named the Duke of Selkirk. Now, the British and the American armies commonly had prisoner of war exchanges. However, the British never allowed prisoner exchanges between Navy prisoners. And Jones thought that if he could capture a British aristocrat, he could persuade the British to exchange him for some American sailors that he wanted to get back. So when they got to the house of this guy, the Duke of Selkirk, they found that he was gone away on a trip and his wife was home alone. But his wife wasn't really alone because she was very pregnant. And so here you have this American raiding party raiding this private residence, and they find a pregnant woman home alone. Okay, so the crew actually went on their best behavior, and they started treating the pregnant woman very, very well, very politely. And Jones was ready to apologize and return back to the Ranger empty-handed. But the crew demanded some prize for their work. They were in this to get prize money, and they wanted to take the family silver. But Jones felt real bad about stealing the silver from a defenseless pregnant lady, and his crew was ready already. It was on the verge of mutiny. So he had to allow them to go ahead and steal all the silver that they had in the house, and so they took their silver, and the chandeliers and everything that they could see that was valuable, carted it back and divided it up among themselves, all the crew members. And somehow the actions of a common thief did not match the dreams of glory in battle on the high seas and the swashbuckling image that John Paul Jones was in search of. So Jones dreamed of being a man of honor and a respected warrior, a gentleman in arms, but he's turned out that he's getting a reputation of a common criminal or a common thief. And later on, Jones felt so bad about this that he sent a letter of apology to the Duke of Selkirk and he actually sent a payment of money to pay for all the silver that was taken. And the repayment was made out of John Paul Jones's personal money, because he was not really happy about what his crew had done, but he knew he was responsible. But instead of heading back to France, when they got back to the Ranger, Jones ordered the Ranger across the Irish Sea to the east coast of Ireland, where they had seen a British ship, the Drake, about a week before. The two ships duked it out, and they went to battle for just over an hour, and the Americans were after a prize. So they were aiming their cannons high up in the rigging to disable the Drake. They were not aiming down to the hole where they would damage the ship and cause it to sink. So they wanted the prize. So they were trying to disable it so that the Drake would surrender. And they did fire grape shot across the deck to discourage the British seamen from manning their guns. And Jones took the Drake and about 164 prisoners back to Brest. And Brest was the main seaport on the Atlantic coast of France. And Benjamin Franklin was able to use the new prisoners to persuade the British to conduct exchanges of naval prisoners. So Navy prisoner of war exchanges became a regular thing after that point for the rest of the war. Now the Ranger was ordered back to America, but Jones was ordered to remain in France. So John Paul Jones had to separate with the crew of the Ranger, which really broke his heart, and I'm sure it didn't break their heart either. Benjamin Franklin was still working with the Dutch authorities, trying to get the 40-gun L'Homme d'Honneur for Jones to command, but those negotiations went real slow and they stalled, and it wasn't going to happen. Well, finally, by the end of 1778, Franklin was able to purchase an old, run-down, broken-down, clumsy, slow, awkward, not built for war ship called the Duc de Duras. Okay, and it was not the ideal ship that Jones wanted, but it was a ship. And after a year at shore, he was ready to take a ship, any ship, and it had to be refitted for war. He couldn't get all the guns and the cannons that he wanted to get for it. He had to take what the French were willing to give up for him, because they had their own ships and their own guns to arm. So he did receive 8 12-pounders, 6 9-pounders, and 6 very old 18-pounders. That when these cannons ended up blowing up on themselves when they did get into battle. We'll talk about that later. But the French, they forbid Jones from enlisting French seamen, so he had to build his crew out of British deserters, a few Americans, and anybody else that happened to be in port that would sign on for him. But upon completion of the refitting, Jones rechristened the ship named after Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, you know, whenever he wrote, he used the pen name Poor Richard. But being that they were in France, he called it the Bonhomme Richard, which basically is the French word for Poor Richard. But more correctly, it doesn't mean the poor Richard. It more means the average man, or the plain man, the man of the street, the middle class plain Joe rather than poor. The Bonhomme Richard left France with 5 other ships on the August 14, 1779. Two of the other ships were privateers who deserted the fleet in search of richer prizes. They wanted profit, so they weren't going to hang around with the Navy. The Alliance was commanded by a French naval officer who seemed to come and go as he pleased, and not necessarily in accordance with what was good for the fleet. So the American fleet was reduced to 3 ships: the Bonhomme Richard, the Peleus, and the Vengeance. On September 23rd, they came upon a 40-ship convoy. These were 40 merchant ships. They were full of naval stores, weapons, and everything that the American Army and Navy needed back home. And these ships were being escorted by only 2 naval vessels: the 50-gun Serapis and the 22-gun Countess of Scarborough. The Bonhomme Richard approached from the south and the Serapis from the north. Jones was flying a British flag, and the 2 ships turned eastward side by side. Captain Richard Pearson of the Serapis shouted to Jones to inquire his identity, although he knew exactly who John Paul Jones was. The conversation was short, and soon the captains began firing at each other. The Palace and the Vengeance battled. The Alliance also showed up, but it stayed away from the action too. After the first exchange of cannon fire, John Paul Jones realized that he was severely outgunned, and he could not win a toe-to-toe slugfest against the Serapis. Jones's ship was slower, less maneuverable, and outgunned. Two of the old 18-pounder cannons that the American ship had blew up on itself when they tried to fire those cannons. And that ended up killing the gun crews and causing damage to the ship. When turning to avoid fire from the Serapis, Jones got the bow of the Bonhomme Richard entangled with the rigging of the Serapis. The American ship had no angle to fire at the British ship, but the British cannons were aimed at the Americans. And this is when Captain Pearson asked Jones if he was ready to surrender, and Jones just gave his famous reply, "I have not yet begun the fight." Jones got the Richard freed from its entanglement, and he tried to close in the range so that the Marines in the rigging could fire down upon the British officers and crew on the Serapis's main deck. The British attempted to stand off at a distance to exploit their firepower advantage, and the Richard tried to get close enough to throw grappling hooks over the Serapis's railings to lash the 2 ships together. Well, finally, Captain Pearson dropped an anchor, hoping to jar the 2 ships apart. And the American sharpshooters in the riggings prevented the British sailors from cutting the 2 ships loose. Okay, during this part of the battle, the Alliance tried to help, but they fired grape shot over the deck of the Bonhomme Richard, and ended up killing more Americans and not even touching the British ship, not even touching the Serapis. With the Marine snipers in the rigging on the Bonhomme Richard, they cleared the deck of the Serapis, and the American's crew was able to jump ship to board the Serapis. At this point, just as the Captain Pearson was about to surrender, 3 American petty officers rushed towards him and said, "Don't surrender, don't surrender. We're going to..." They tried to surrender first, but when Jones saw that the Americans, his petty officers, were trying to surrender, he ordered the Marine sharpshooters to shoot them. And so as the battle continued, Pearson finally did surrender, and when the battle was over, Jones invited Pearson into his cabin aboard the Bonhomme Richard, and they had a glass of wine together. And then they looked around at the 2 ships, and everybody boarded the Serapis, and they stood on the deck of the Serapis, and they watched the Bonhomme Richard sink into the ocean. Okay, well, who won this battle? Obviously, the Bonhomme Richard sunk, but the Americans captured the Serapis. However, the Serapis, his mission was to guard the 40 merchant ships, the 40 unarmed merchant ships that were full of all the war supplies that Jones wanted to capture. So during the battle, these 40 ships were able to sail away scot-free, untouched, unharmed, and uncaptured. And John Paul Jones didn't catch any of them. But he was able to survive. He won the battle. His ship sunk, but he was riding on a much better ship on the Serapis from that point on. So who won the battle? Hey, my name is John Sorensen, and thank you for listening to AmericanNavalHistory.com.